Many of us remember when we just turned 16 and the thoughts of being behind a steering wheel and feeling the freedom that is that very wheel between your fingertips. I woke up on my 16th birthday almost 6 years ago, ready to take on the test and take on the world. Or so you'd think. You see, every day since my 15th birthday, I would think to myself, this only gets me closer and closer to my driver's license. However, 365 days passed, and I was on the eve of my 16th birthday. However, instead of dreaming about cars, I was thinking about the new pair of volleyball court shoes I had my eye on. I was brainstorming of a really cool place I could go celebrate with my friends. I was putting off getting my license, thinking, I've got time. Soon enough, another 2 years rolled by, and it was the autumn of my senior year in high school. At this point, I had countless friends who had not only attained their learner's license, but also had their novice license, and were now driving me to school. In fact, so many people had their license that at that time, I thought to myself, somebody needs to be their buddy, riding in their car with them. Nobody likes to drive alone. And this was certainly true. Day after day, I had offers of friends to drive me home, and so the temptation to get my learner's license faded even more so into the background. This phase did not last long. In a couple of months, I began to be labeled for my inability to drive. No longer was I needed by others to keep them company. I was a nuisance. I always needed to build my schedule around those who had a car. Or even worse, I would try to manipulate those with cars to work around my schedule. And I was quickly realizing that my thoughts on having enough time were running out. November 11th, 2008 rolled around the corner, and I decided that maybe now it was a good time to get the ball rolling. My gracious mother drove me over to our local testing center, a place I would soon revisit more so than I would like to mention. And as I approached the computer, a big swell of nerves crawled up my arms like tiny spiders, and I began to feel the sweat well up in the back of my neck. And as I took my place in front of the computer screen, I began to tremble. But as soon as the first question flashed in front of my face, I clicked the right answer, and I began to gain confidence that the rest of the test would be a delight, and I passed with flying colors. Finally, I was ready to really begin this process of getting behind the wheel. Or so I thought. In all truth, and to my shame, this small victory was one in a very long row of failures and procrastination on the road to learning what it means to get things done without banking on the dream that is, I've got time. And what a dream it is! My friends had advised me to begin taking driving lessons with a woman whose students, all but two, had always passed their road test examinations. It wasn't so much that I didn't want to take the test purely out of laziness, which is partially true. It was also because of my fear of failure. In fact, it was this fear of being made fun of by classmates in school that led to my pursuit of attaining my learner's license. And now it was that same fear of failure that was keeping me from getting on and taking my road test. The fear culminated in 3 failed road tests. One after the other only made the next one more terrifying, and the length of time between each failed road test just increased. Each margin of error also began to increase as well. I went from failing to parallel park to almost running over a pedestrian at the 4-way stop. I knew by the end of my failed 3rd attempt that I had serious issues in the pursuit of my license. My term that I thought in my head, my idea that I've got time, was no longer a carefree term. It almost made me more anxious. It became an excuse for allowing more days to go before I would book another road test. And what was in my mind, another failed road test. I remember sitting in my room in the dark, just after my 3rd failure. I could still smell the evergreen car freshener that I purchased right before the test. It was almost like that smell was haunting me. I smelled the failure, and in my head, I thought that my family expected me to fail, that my friends would assume that I would take public transit for the rest of my life. I looked in the mirror, and I saw failure. And I said to myself, as I looked in the mirror, I've got time, I guess, with my head sunken and feeling completely defeated. And this was the way I continued to think until the Lord graciously allowed a friend to speak into my life and speak to the fears and the lies in my head telling me I was going to fail. She spoke to me tenderly, encouraging me that she wanted me to be able to drive around with her, that there's no use waiting and not much time anyways. However, the way in which she talked to me didn't make me feel rushed or scared. She spurred me on. She told me to actually try praying about these fears and assuming that the Lord would hear my plea every step of the way. She told me to sit still and think simply. She walked through the difficulties of this challenge with me, and it was God's grace and kindness speaking through her voice to me on a regular basis. I soon booked my fourth, and what I didn't know would be my final road test. As I practiced with my mother and father, they too even noted this shifted my confidence as a driver. I would practice then pray, my 2 P's. Each day closer had me in an anticipation of how I knew God would meet me in that moment behind the wheel. I still remember my morning devotion I read earlier that day that I took the test. It was from Exodus, recalling how God led his people by night with a pillar of fire and by day with a pillar of cloud. And I remember getting on my knees and praying for that same pillar to go before and behind me as I took that driver's test. And the most interesting part about this 4th road test was the occasion that God had painted in order for me to trust him. It was almost like everything that could go wrong went wrong. There was a huge rainstorm outside with drops so heavy they bounced up and got my pants wet. It was slightly foggy too, and to make things worse, my stomach was in a complete knot, and I could barely sit up straight because I was so nervous. But in all these things, I knew that God was going to lead me and show me that he would bring me through this test. I no longer thought, sadly, that, I've got time, but rather that it was now God's time. I was ready to take that test. And from the moment I buckled my seatbelt to the sound of the final check mark I could hear on my instructor's clipboard, I knew that the Lord had provided for me. I can't begin to describe the test because I simply don't remember any more details. It's like a pleasant fog in the back of my mind, and I am only now certain that God provided for me with what is now between my fingertips, my driver's license. And while it is no longer driver's license tests, it is the road of life that lays in front of me, testing me to choose to pretend that I've got time and procrastinate, or to trust that each day's moments are all God's time. The freedom I grasp between my fingertips, the wheel of the car, it's not just this literal wheel of the car that I'm driving behind. More importantly, it is the wheel of my own will. I'm continually driving life's tests on God's time and with his gracious help.